Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. So, today we're going to cover the ground vehicles for Tier 3 Britain and conclude whether they're worth getting, considering, or avoiding for your lineups. Sorry for the wait, building work again has delayed this video a bit, but thankfully it's all done now. So, let's crack on. As always, I really hope you enjoy. So, first off today is the Firefly. Standard Sherman design, but housing the British 17-pounder gun instead. It's a solid vehicle, but does come with some drawbacks not present on the other Shermans. First of all, because of the gun, it doesn't come with a stabilizer, and it's also a lot less mobile. Currently, it has a 425 horsepower engine compared to the American 4.7 Sherman, which has an 878 horsepower engine and a higher top speed. The Firefly's turret rotation is also slower as well. Armour-wise, it does get a weaker hull arguably, with two outcrops on the front displaying 50mm of flat armour. However, its extra track armour modification is much more effective than that found on the other American 76 Shermans. It doesn't change much, but at least it's something. So, after all that, you probably want to hear something positive, and well, the gun, as always, is great. You won't really struggle to pen anything with a 17-pounder at this tier, even at the longer ranges. But to be honest, it's really a toss-up as to whether this gun is actually better than the 76 M1 found on the US Shermans, as it's only really fair to compare them. I personally prefer the American cannon, as there's not many tanks really that the 17 can pen that the M1 can't. There's probably a lot more, but off the top of my head, the only tank I can really think of would be the Panzer 470 that the M1 gun struggles with. Though the 17-pounder is much better at punching through angled armour, so they both work and have their advantages, but the 17-pounder is definitely harder to secure kills with. Back to the Firefly itself though. When stock, it really does struggle, as it's very slow and doesn't get the extra arm protection yet, though the stock round it gets isn't abysmally bad, to be fair to it. The Firefly is very much a campy tank. The gun bounce when coming to a stop is really significant, and that makes snapshots very tricky to pull off. So this tank, like many others, is all about finding a good position, which isn't amazingly easy for this tank, as it only has -5 degrees of gun depression, making most ridgelines out of the question. Meaning, as far as safety and consistency is concerned, you're mainly limited to hard cover on flat-ish ground, which isn't always available. So, generally speaking, there's no perfect position for this tank, but whatever map you find yourself on, I'd recommend staying at range if possible. Your armour at close range can be easily picked apart, but at further ranges, and especially from the Russian guns, your armour does start to become fairly effective, but of course not from Tigers or Panthers or from any guns of similar performance. The Firefly doesn't work well aggressively like the other Shermans, so stay around cover and avoid being on the move in locations where you could engage. If you do need to push up though, advance from cover to cover in chunks. Practically every other vehicle can level out its gun quicker than you, so you really don't want to be caught out on the move. It is of course as well possible to play it at close quarters, as long as you're letting the enemies come to you. You're going to want to stay still in any case. So, pros? Great gun. And the cons? Poor mobility, and unreliable armour. Verdict: despite its flaws, I'd still get it, as it does have the ability to knock out or disable practically anything it fights, despite not being the easiest tank to use. It does also fit nicely into a lineup too, but we'll get to that near the end. Next up is the Comet. This tank shares a lot in common with the Cromwells in the last episode, and like its namesake, it is very nimble. Not the best regarding top speed, but it accelerates very well and has one of the fastest neutral steering performances out of all the World War II era tanks. It's also the first tank BR-wise to use Sabo. Some of you watching might not have ever used this round before, so I'll briefly cover it. Sabo has a lot of penetration power, especially against sloped armour, but trades as penetration for poor post-pen damage. It doesn't shrapnel nearly as widely as AP rounds, but it does do a lot of damage in a condensed area, meaning it does ammo rack more consistently. The Sabo is a modification though, and the Comet's stock AP round isn't too great. The Comet doesn't use the 17-pounder and loses a fair bit of penetration comparatively. It's far from unusable though, but just bear in mind it does definitely lack the punch the 17 has when stock. Armour-wise, the hull is very similar to the Cromwell's. It gets a little bit more armour there, but the turret actually might surprise you. It's 102mm thick, with some spots being double stacked also at 102mm. Additionally, a lot of the turret isn't flat either, so it's actually really effective at tanking shots. Even 88s will bounce from time to time. The Comet does actually have a lot going for it and can work effectively in multiple situations. For playstyle, I'd recommend you play it very similarly to the Cromwells but a bit more mindfully, and utilise hull down positions much more frequently as your turret armour really is that good. As for your ammo, I'd main Sabo but also take some of the capped AP rounds as well. Not many, but around 10 or so. It's very hard to one-shot tanks from the side if you are using Sabo unless you hit ammo, so I take a few of these to switch to if you hit a tank side on in the engine etc, just to guarantee that the next shot does knock them out. As this tank is decently quick, it is easy to overextend, especially if you initially don't come across much opposition, and this will consistently get you killed, as if you're caught out in the open, you're not going to have the time to turn around and drive off. And if you take a hit to the hull, you're likely getting taken out. The last thing you want is to run into an enemy on the move in the open, so be mindful of this and actively try to avoid the possibility of these engagements happening at all. I'd honestly just head for a good spot hull down. You can do decent work in a spot like this and have the ability to adapt as the match goes on. You have the speed to advance at a good pace, and if you need to retreat, you have smokes and that fantastic neutral steering to get you out of trouble. Also, like some of the other British vehicles, be mindful of AA, as you have a fairly exposed turret ring you can't hide, and most AA you'll face can easily pen you even at range, so just remember you are vulnerable to their fire. So, pros: good gun, great mobility, good hull down protection, and versatile. And the cons: poor reverse gear, and even though the armour is good, it can't completely be relied on. Verdict: get it. This is easily one of the most reliable tanks for this tier and functions in up tiers well too. When upgraded, you have a lot of options available to you, so this is definitely one to focus on getting. Next up is the Challenger, and like its name implies, it's fairly underappreciated I feel. It's not amazingly easy to use, but it does have some attributes that might be worth your time. It's a lot similar to the Comet, but less versatile, survivable and mobile, but it does make up for that in the firepower department in several respects. First of all, it's equipped with the 17 pounder, which this time comes with Sabo. The Sabo sports a fairly impressive penetration performance, and also, due to the two loaders, it fires a lot faster. I have an ace crew on mine and I can shoot every 5.1 seconds. On an expert crew, it's 5.4. It also has incredible turret traverse at 31 degrees a second on an expert crew, which is actually faster than some anti-air vehicles, believe it or not. The problem though is that it doesn't have any meaningful fallbacks. Its turret is very tall and it's just not quite fast enough on the traverse and acceleration fronts to get out of trouble reliably. And quite validly, I think this is why most people dislike the vehicle. But like all vehicles that only excel in firepower, it's all about the positioning. The Challenger is best utilised in cover, at a location that has the potential to cover a wide area and multiple sightlines. You can fire very quick and swing your turret around very fast, so an area like this is absolutely ideal if you want to have a meaningful impact on the match. A while ago actually I did a review on this vehicle. A lot of the information is somewhat outdated, but the live match I show is a good example of what sort of location you should be aiming to play around, so a link to that will be in the description if you'd like to get a more in-depth look at the tank. Safe to say as well though that it also works great at long range. The gun is relatively easy to aim despite the inaccuracy of Sabo rounds, and because you fire so quickly, you can easily get a few shots off before the enemy gets a chance to fire back at you, which can be really important. Especially if you only hit a tank's engine and it starts turning its turret towards you, 9 times out of 10 in this situation you can rattle off another round before the enemy gets its gun on you. Anyway, pros: great gun, effective reload, and mobile. And the cons: poor reactionary mobility, and the lack of combat fallbacks. What I mean by that is its lack of ability to retreat to cover if it gets caught out. Verdict: consider it. It can work really well, but it's not very easy to use and doesn't have a lot of potential on most maps, so it can very easily get into situations where it really struggles to be effective. If you feel confident, pick it up as it can fit into some lineups, but if not, you wouldn't be making a mistake in avoiding it. Next up for our heavy tanks, we're going to start off with the Churchill Mk V. Compared to the Mk I, it's a slight downgrade in armour and speed, but an upgrade in firepower. This one is equipped with the 6 pounder gun, and to be honest I really like it. This tank is one of my all-time favourites. though it's not as good as it was since more tanks have since been added that can easily cut through its armour, but it can still perform very effectively. Like the previous vehicles, it does play similarly to the Mark I again, so stick that cruise gear on, angle slightly and fire fast. Interestingly, this tank uses a slightly upgraded version of the 6-pounder, giving it around 10mm of extra penetration over most ranges and angles. But you do need to be on your guard a little bit more than the previous vehicles, as pretty much everything you fight can punch through your armour if you're not careful. If you're fighting an enemy head on, angle the left side of your tank towards the enemy. This covers up a rather large weak spot on the hull where the MG port is. If you're facing Russian 76mm guns or anything with around 100mm of penetration, angle your turret slightly too. This will increase its overall thickness to around 100mm. This does create a slight weak spot where the corners of the turret slope, but I found I rarely get hit there anyway. The Germans, as always, will give you trouble though. There's no safe way to protect your turret from their guns, but you can angle your hull to get it covered completely. If you're past 1000 meters, you can angle your turret to become relatively immune, but this is a rare situation and shouldn't really be relied on. Like the previous heavies, the best attribute you have is that window of reaction time. So as long as you don't get ambushed or flanked, you should be able to get the first shot off, which is going to be more reliable this time around due to the gun you carry. Try and target tanks on the move. You can fire quicker than they can, and if you don't disable them in one shot, you can comfortably land another one most of the time before they get a chance to fire back at you. Try and stay around some sort of cover too. You might be well armoured all around, but if you get your turret or engine taken out, there's not a lot you can really do. You do have roof mounted smokes, but you're just too slow to get out of trouble. The Churchill works best at range and cruising at close quarters. Remember to watch your flanks and angle at the right times, and you'll definitely be a real threat. So, pros? Good effective armour, and good firepower. And the cons? Poor mobility, and poor reactionary mobility. Same thing, I guess. Verdicts? Get it. I really do like this tank, so I might be a bit biased, but it does have a lot of potential. Stick with your allies and try not to get caught out. Helpfully, the skills you've learned while playing the previous heavies will help you out here too, so if you've enjoyed them so far, I'm sure you'll like this one a lot too. Last but not least for the heavies is our final Churchill, the Mk VII, and it's probably the most interesting out of all of them in how it plays. Simply, it sacrifices firepower for a lot of armour. Not including the extra track armour, it has 152mm on the turret and hull frontally. It is cast armour, so it's slightly less thick effectively against rounds, but it's still very good and negates a fair few guns you can run into. And when you get the extra track armour, it's even better. The gun though is what makes it hard to use. It uses the same 75mm gun found on the Cromwell at 3.3, and seeing as you can meet Tigers, Panthers and the IS series, taking out certain vehicles can be really tricky. But as long as you aren't up-tiered too much, most vehicles will really struggle against you as well. Some you meet won't be able to pen you anywhere frontally, save from a few inconsistent weak spots, or if they're using APCR, but let's be honest, how often do players use that anyway? Your mobility though is very poor, but oddly enough this does somewhat work in your favour, as it allows you not to overextend too much. By the time you reach combat, the front line, as it were, has already been established, so you can play around that area with your allies and take a lot of shots. Also, because you have a muzzle brake on your gun, it's a lot easier for enemies to knock your barrel out, and most of the time, an experienced player will be aiming for your barrel in order to then knock it out and flank you. So if you see a tank at close range scoping you in, keep on the move and slightly angle your turret as to not give the enemy a flat shot on your barrel, as if they take it out, you're pretty much stuffed, like a really fat chicken. I usually don't like recommending this, but if you're not super confident with this vehicle, I'd only play this tank at 5.3, maybe even 5.0 and below, and just not use it in a full up tier, as it loses pretty much all of its reliable advantages. And at that tier, you'd be much more used to the team and taking out one of the other 4.7 vehicles, and let's be honest, it's not fun spending a few minutes trundling up to the combat area and getting one shot by something you can't even penetrate. At 4.7 and 5.0 though, it's a beast. T-34s, Panzer IVs and Cheetos can't scratch you if you're angled, even at close range. This tank also does well around cap points, as you can really lock them down from most vehicles, though in a spot like this you are a massive bomb magnet. In any case, you're going to want to stick at mid to close ranges. Your gun at this tier is fairly weak and you're going to want to get the most out of it. At long range you have little hope of penning anything, so the closer you are, the easier it's going to be to pick out enemy weak spots. So, pros, amazing armour, and the cons, poor mobility, poor firepower, and low versatility. Verdict, get it. Despite its negatives, its armour is what I'd class as an overwhelming advantage, and all vehicles that have this are worth getting in my opinion. It doesn't work in up tiers or on all maps, but in the right set of circumstances you can be close to invincible. First, for our tank destroyers, we have the Achilles. This is basically a slightly worse performing M10 with a 17-pounder gun. It's slightly slower than the M10, the turret traverse is slower as well, but it does have a great gun. At 4.0 it does one shot fairly effectively, and you will definitely disable whatever you penetrate. It's much nicer to use than the Archer. However, it does play fairly similarly to the Archer in some respects, but it's a lot easier to use and a bit more versatile. It works best hull down at range. Because the gun traverse is so poor, like the Archer, the further away your target is from you, the easier they're going to be to deal with. Your gun performance at range still outmatches pretty much everything, so at engaging at close range, all you're really doing is making your opponent's guns more effective against you. Your manlit hull down is also not the easiest thing to penetrate. You can't reliably tank shots, but you will bounce from time to time and rarely get one shot if you do get penetrated there. The one thing you don't want to do in this tank though is overextend, as you're pretty helpless if you do. If you get your engine or driver hit, you're basically done for, as there's no way you can get your turret on target if an enemy is on your flanks. Because this vehicle is quite light though, you can swing your hull around fairly quickly, so keep this in mind if you do get caught out. If you're advancing on the move and it's not 100% clear where the next enemy will come from, make sure you keep your gun centralised. If it's off to one side, you'll have to use your hull traverse or wait for the gun to get on target if an enemy is off at the other angle. Keeping it in the middle saves a lot of time potentially and might even save your life. So, pros, great gun, and the cons, poor survivability, terrible reactionary mobility, and low versatility. Verdict, get it. The advantage of a tank like this is that the gun will always work even if you're up tiered, and being a TD, it's very cheap to spawn too. As long as you play it safe and keep it a fair range, you have the potential to do a lot of work with this vehicle. Next up is the Avenger. A fairly unconventional tank destroyer as far as consistency as the game is concerned, as it functions more or less like a mobile medium tank. It has a fair bit in common with the Challenger actually. Its speed and mobility is very similar, it even uses the same gun, just without Sabo. And for 4.7 it's definitely capable, but like other tanks we've covered today, just not super easy to use. And as far as fallbacks are concerned, this tank doesn't really have any. It has no smoke grenades or even a coaxial MG. Its armour won't be saving you much either. This tank punishes mistakes more than the others we've covered so far, so the safest way to play it is to not put yourself in a position that allows for those mistakes to happen. You'll need to rely on aspects of this vehicle that are the hardest to counter, and those are its mobility and its firepower. By the point you unlock this vehicle, you're probably going to be pretty familiar with how the gun handles, which is a good start. As for where to put yourself though, flank and snipe and not much else. You can't brawl, and putting yourself in a spot you might need to retreat from is going to be pretty tricky as you don't have any fallbacks, so you can't get caught out. The best thing you can do is push a fair way into the map initially and find a good spot and just stick around that area. Hills work best as you can use your mobility to pop in and out of cover at slightly different points along the same stretch. Remember to keep your hull angled sideways as well if you need to drive away quickly. I definitely stick to this method early game while all the best tanks are driving around. Late game, you can afford to be a bit more mobile if the map's going in your favour. You can cover most of the map fairly quickly if your team is low on cap points, and you can easily flank and catch out lone vehicles later on in the match. So, pros, good firepower, and good mobility. And the cons, poor survivability, poor reactionary mobility, and lack of combat fallbacks. Verdict, still, get it. This tank does have worthwhile and effective attributes and makes up a great lineup, but just remember it isn't the easiest vehicle to use overall. But as long as your aim is good and you stick at a decent range, you should be fine. Lastly today is our anti-air, the Crusader AA Mk II. Very simple to explain this one, it used the same turret as the armoured car AA from the last episode, with the hull of the Crusader Mk III, with very few meaningful changes. So there's not really too much to say about this one really. Like before though, I'd recommend only using the AP belt or the mixed belt. It's also a lot lighter than the Crusaders, which makes its mobility really good, but because its penetration is quite low for the tier, the extra mobility doesn't count for too much as you can't reliably hunt tanks with it. But you can't be hull broken, and you can rush caps fairly effectively as you'll more than likely be able to take out any light vehicles you meet. In any case though, it's still a decent anti-air platform, just not an outstanding one. Pros: good mobility, and good survivability for an anti-air. And the cons: poor anti-tank ability. No need for a verdict here really, it's subjectively better than the previous AA in every way, so of course you're going to want to get it. This is arguably the most effective anti-air you're going to get until tier 5. There is another option, but we'll get into that in the next episode. Next up are our premiums, and we're going to start off very quickly with an unobtainable vehicle just to run through it quickly. This is the Achilles again, but from the 65th Tank Destroyer Regiment. It's identical to the regular version of the tree, it just came with some decals, not even a special camo or anything like that. This was one of the initial British pre-order vehicles back in the day, and because it's an exact copy, you're not really missing much. You could just put a talisman on the regular vehicle. If it came back as a cheap Golden Eagle premium, picking it up wouldn't be a mistake. Next up is the Excelsior. This one I'm also going to count as technically unobtainable, as there's only 3 on the marketplace and the cheapest one is just over 500 Gaijin coin currently, so yeah, not really worth it. It's just another Matilda type tank really, either you're invincible or you die off the bat. If it ever comes on the market at a decent price though, consider getting it as it does have a lineup and does make for some fun games, but for the time being, there are much better options for grinding anyway. Next up is another copy, the Iron Duke. This is a Comet that just comes with some extra decals and premium status. It's currently available on the market in limited numbers and is currently being sold for 25 Gaijin coins. It's a bit too expensive for what it is, but I do think it's somewhat worth considering. It's a great tank and makes the 5.0 lineup viable with a 4.7 backup of your choice. The Comet's working an up tier, and making a 5.0 lineup means avoiding the 6.3 power creep, so you can grind relatively peacefully. It is expensive, but if you like the Comet and the idea of avoiding 6.3 for the meantime seems appealing, have a think about it. Next up is the Polish Firefly, the Scorpion. It's objectively better than the Tech Tree Firefly, it's faster, has more effective armour, and carries an oddly hefty price tag of 4,000 Golden Eagles. This was initially one of the UK's pre-order CBT tanks, so maybe that's why it's so expensive. In any case, you can buy a talisman on the regular Firefly for less than 3 times the price. Is it worth it? Well, it's objectively better of course, but not really enough to pay that sort of price, so I'm going to say that it's not worth it. For that amount of Golden Eagles, you can really speed up the grind down the line, or even just talisman the regular Firefly if you like it. Lastly is probably the most interesting premium for this tier, the AC4 Sentinel. This is an Australian tank featuring good armour, decent mobility and the 17 pounder. It's a good combination of attributes and is about 1,000 Golden Eagles cheaper than the Firefly, but for 5.3, none of its attributes are amazingly effective. Its mobility is about average, maybe a bit above average, its armour can be cut through by the 85 and 88 pretty easily, and its firepower, while effective, isn't overwhelmingly so. It does commonly see up tiers as well, which really hurt its overall effectiveness. It also doesn't have an amazing lineup either. It does though have a very nice reverse gear, and its armour, while unreliable, can and will bounce shots, especially from Panzer IVs and guns of similar performance, but it just isn't reliable. Is it worth it? Well, it's really hard to say as a grinder, it's not consistently effective, which is what you really want. I wouldn't say that it's amazingly beginner friendly either. However, it is a good vehicle and does work, so I'm going to say that for the price, it is worth it. Though, if you're not very confident with tanks, give it a miss. The up tiers are fairly tricky to deal with. I personally think this should be brought back down to 5.0 again, as it does have glaring weak spots its opponents can take advantage of, and it'd also help in avoiding those up tiers and make for a really good lineup with the Comet. If it does get down tiered, I'd be a lot more positive about getting it. It wouldn't be a waste of money, but I still wouldn't say it's a perfect choice. So that ends all of our tanks for today, but before the final lineups, let's have a look at the planes for this tier. First off, we have the Firefly Mk V at 4.0. very similar to the previous variant, but this one can carry double the RP3s at 16 in total, and the rockets are only a tier 2 modification, which makes the grind a lot nicer. But bear in mind, if there are enemy planes or anti-air up, you'll likely not have the manoeuvrability required to evade effectively. If the sky is clear though, you will 100% mop up. It's definitely one to consider. Next up is a very new addition, the Firecrest. This is one of the squadron vehicles and isn't too bad for 4.0 as well. It can unlock 8 RP3s and has very good low speed characteristics, which makes it perfect for the combined battle environment. You can stall and recover easily, and even though you have low ammo, the M350 cals can still take out enemy planes and kill some tanks top down. It's a lengthy process to get it unlocked and spaded, but it's still a good option if you have the time. Next up is an interesting pick, the Tempest Vickers P. This is a Tempest Mk V, but with two 47mm guns. They perform very well top down for disabling tanks, but stock and even when upgraded, they're very inaccurate, way too inaccurate in my opinion. You do get lots of ammo though, and once you get it upgraded, you can take out any vehicle top down pretty much. It's also great for assists as well. It's worth having a go at in any case. Next up is the Typhoon 1B Late. It's a nice versatile aircraft that can dogfight and ground attack effectively. It has 4 20mm cannons and can carry 2 1,000-pound bombs or 8 RP3s. It's not too expensive, stalls well, and works well beyond its tier 2. It's definitely worth picking up. Next up is the Premium Wyvern. At €30, it's a bit too expensive to pick up just for tank matches, as other vehicles do what it does better in my opinion, but it can still do work. It can carry 16 RP3s or 3 1,000-pound bombs that have 2 drops. It's big and heavy though, meaning you're easy prey for anti-air and enemy fighters, and it does struggle with stall maneuvers as well. What it's best at in my opinion is zooming in with the bombs, getting them off and heading back to base to rearm. It can do work, but it's not worth the price tag if you only plan on using it in combined battles. Lastly is the Sea Fury. Pretty competent aircraft, it's fast and manoeuvrable enough, and can carry 12 RP3s. It does take a while to spade it though, and the RP3s are a tier 4 modification, but it's a lot more versatile than previous options and can take out planes and tanks alike. There are other aircraft later on that are better than this one, but if you plan on staying at 5.3, 5.7, it is a good option. So there we are guys, hope you enjoyed the video. On the screen now are the best lineups that I think we can make out of tier 3, and yeah, hope you've enjoyed the video. Sorry it's taken a while, I just been very busy with lots of other stuff, trying to make a bit of money on the side. That sounds like I'm a drug dealer. I'm not. Not a fan. Had a pint the other day. Cried for 10 minutes afterwards. Bit of a joke. Tactical humour right at the end there. I'm going to go before I embarrass myself anymore. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. And hopefully the next one will come relatively soon, as I'm already starting to work on it already. So yeah. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you next time.